In northern Tanzania, a volcano laid down a sheet of wet ash. 3 individuals walked across it, and a second eruption sealed the surface before it could erode. The trail at Laetoli runs almost 27 meters, holds roughly 70 footprints, and dates to 3.66 million years ago, the oldest undisputed record of full-time upright walking anywhere. No stone tools, the oldest known are 3.3 million years old, some 360,000 years further on. No long stride, the prints sit close together, the signature of short legs. No sign anywhere in the record that they carried a single thing. What the ash caught instead was a heel striking the ground first and weight rolling forward along the sole. It caught a big toe lying in line with the other 4, rather than splaying off like a thumb. Anatomists call that an adducted hallux, and it is the feature that separates this trail from any apes. It is the foot you are standing on. The tempting question is which creature stood up first, and that question has no answer worth having. The better one, the one that changes what your own legs mean, is why a body that got worse at almost everything won anyway. Not an invention, a leftover. An adult Hadza forager in northern Tanzania covers 9 to 14 kilometers of ground on an unremarkable working day. The number is measured, not guessed. GPS units worn during ordinary foraging logged 2,078 person days of movement, a record of hunter-gatherer travel larger than anything collected before it. Within that record, the men walked further, ranged across more ground, and followed more winding paths than the women, whose routes stayed nearer camp. Converted into steps, the daily total falls between 12 and 18,000. That is close to what a person in an industrial society accumulates across most of a week. Set against other apes, the gap widens further, because hunter-gatherers cover 3 to 5 times more ground each day than any great ape alive. Distance on that scale stops being a habit and becomes a cost. Every kilometer carries a price. Walking costs an adult body about 30 kilocalories per kilometer, half what running the same distance would take. So a 12-kilometer day runs to roughly 360 kilocalories spent before a single fruit has been picked. The charge is fixed, and it falls due in advance of any return. Foraging can fail, the kilometers have already been bought. What follows from that is the radius a body can afford, and the radius decides what counts as food. A cheap traveler works a landscape where the patches sit far apart, arriving with enough margin left to make the journey worth making. An expensive one is confined to whatever grows inside a smaller circle. When that circle empties, there is no second option, only a slower version of starving. 2 animals can stand in the same forest, eat the same fruit, and still occupy different worlds. Neither is smarter, braver, or better equipped. The difference is arithmetic. And in late Miocene Africa, no primate body then in existence was built to pay it. Upright walking is usually pictured as a stable posture that happens to travel. The mechanics describe something much closer to the opposite of that. Across a human stride, each leg spends roughly 40% of the cycle carrying the entire body by itself. The 2 brief windows when both feet are on the ground account for only about 20% between them. For most of every step, the whole mass balances over a single point of contact. A quadruped keeps 3 limbs down whenever one lifts, so its center of mass never leaves the area of support. A biped has no such margin. Each step is a fall that gets caught. The compensation is supposed to be the pendulum. A walking body vaults over the planted leg, trading height for speed, and speed back into height, an exchange that costs nothing in principle. In practice, it leaks badly. A human recovers about 65% of the mechanical energy across a stride, where an ideal pendulum would recover all of it. The missing third has to be put back by muscle, step after step. The exchange also works within a narrow band of speed, peaking near 1.5 meters per second and degrading on either side. Walk slower or faster than that, and the leak widens, and the leak itself has a specific location inside the step. Every heel strike is a collision. The foot meets the ground while the body is still traveling downward and forward, and part of that momentum is destroyed on impact. The opposite leg then has to push off to restore whatever the collision took away. 2 of those transitions happen inside every single stride. Tens of thousands of strides fill a single day of foraging, and every one of them is charged against the 9 to 14 kilometers already on the bill. A newborn chimpanzee holds on. It grips its mother with hands and with feet, and stays attached while she moves, which costs her almost nothing beyond the extra weight. Infants in the human lineage lost that ability somewhere along the way, and they lost it completely. The grasping foot went, the coat to hold went, and the newborn now arrives too undeveloped to grip anything at all. The work transfers to the adult, and that transfer has been measured. Carrying a model infant in the arms costs about 16% more energy than moving the same weight in a sling. Estimates of the full metabolic burden of in-arms carrying run to roughly 500 kilocalories a day. Set that beside the 360 kilocalories a 12-kilometer foraging day already demands. The daily charge more than doubles. Women carrying infants also take shorter steps, which raises the cost of covering the same ground. Outside of nursing itself, transporting infants is the most expensive form of parental investment yet described. The cost of all this is not measured only in calories. One of two forelimbs is committed for years rather than afternoons, in an animal that already spends most of every step balanced on one leg. Popular accounts of this story add a final entry to the ledger. The claim is that walking upright narrowed the birth canal and made human childbirth uniquely dangerous. The evidence there is unsettled. Dunsworth and colleagues, and later Warrener and colleagues, found that a wider pelvis does not measurably raise the energy cost of walking. That finding removes the mechanism the older account had depended upon. Grunstra and colleagues have replied that abandoning the trade-off is premature. The difficulty of human birth itself is not disputed by anyone. Its cause is. What can be stated without argument is that these losses are real, specific, and counted. The threshold that all of them had to be worth clearing has not been counted at all. Human walking is about 75% cheaper than anything a chimpanzee can manage on the ground, and that figure did not come out of a model. Sockol, Raichlen, and Pontzer put adult chimpanzees and adult humans on treadmills and measured oxygen consumption directly, alongside the forces each body sent into the ground. Humans came out cheap for their body size and roughly a quarter as expensive to move as a chimpanzee. That is the threshold. A body that reaches it can afford the 14-kilometer day, and a body that misses it cannot. The second number from the same study is the one that turns this into a barrier. Within the chimpanzee sample, walking on 2 legs cost around 10% more than walking on 4. The difference was not statistically significant across the group taken as a whole, though most of the individuals showed one when they were examined separately. Either way, the direction is clear. An ape that rises onto 2 legs and walks does not begin saving energy. It starts paying a surcharge. The gap between those two numbers is the entire problem, because 75% below is where the reward sits, while 10% above is where the attempt has to begin. Nothing about the posture itself delivers the saving. The saving belongs to the hardware. It comes from hips and knees that extend fully, so that the force arriving from the ground passes close to both joints. That geometry cuts the volume of muscle, which must be switched on for each unit of force applied. Chimpanzee pelvic anatomy forbids it, and forces a flexed hip and a flexed knee throughout the stride. So nothing separating an ape from a cheap day of walking can be described as a choice. What separates them is a pelvis of another shape, a femur set at another angle, and a foot that does not yet exist anywhere on the planet. The record that ought to settle when this happened cannot settle it. Sahelanthropus chadensis, recovered in Chad, is roughly 7 million years old, and the oldest serious candidate for the human line. Its entire published limb material amounts to 1 thigh bone and 2 broken forearm fragments. In 2020, a team examined that femur and concluded its shape ruled out habitual walking on 2 legs. In 2022, a different team published in Nature and concluded the opposite. And in 2024, a third group replied that the evidence still failed to support habitual bipedalism. In 2026, a fourth group examined the same bones and described an early biped descended from an ape ancestor. 1 femur, 4 peer-reviewed papers, 2 irreconcilable answers. Whether those 3 bones even belong to the same individual as the skull has itself been questioned. That pattern is worth sitting with, because it changes what kind of question this is. The disagreement reflects no carelessness on anyone's part. That is what happens when a question demanding a moment is put to evidence which cannot supply one. The shortage is structural. Foot bones are the most informative parts of a walking skeleton and among the least likely to survive, being small, buried in soft tissue, and easily consumed by scavengers. Even the good specimens arrive broken. Arty, the partial skeleton of Ardipithecus ramidus, came out of the ground in 125 separate pieces. Reassembling and scanning them consumed 15 years before anything could be published. Each new specimen tends to widen the range of possibilities rather than narrow it. The fossil record holds no first upright individual waiting to be found, only scattered and crushed and contested fragments, separated by hundreds of thousands of years. Somewhere inside those gaps, the arithmetic changed sign. No bone names the morning. The bones cannot say when, but living apes can say how. Bipedal walking was never an invention of the human line. It was already in the repertoire, and it remains in use today. Wild Sumatran orangutans stand and walk on the thinnest branches at the outer edge of the canopy. That is where the fruit hangs, and where nothing will hold a body that tries to sit on it. Biologists call it the terminal branch niche. The name marks the outer shell of a tree crown, rich in food and unable to bear weight. Roughly 7% of orangutan locomotion is bipedal walking, and about 3/4 of that is done with a hand gripping something overhead. The revealing detail here is what the legs are doing. On a branch bending under them, orangutans straighten the knee and the hip, exactly as a human does when running across a springy surface. Every other primate bends them instead, so the posture was not the hard part, because the posture was already there. What changed instead was the ground underneath it. Now, African C4 grass ecosystems expanded across the northwest and the east of the continent at some point after 10 million years ago. Leaf wax records from deep-sea cores show that expansion arriving without any matching shift in rainfall, which points at falling atmospheric carbon dioxide rather than drought. Whatever drove it, the shape of the landscape changed for good. Food stopped being distributed the way a closed forest distributes it. The patches moved apart, and once they did, the variable deciding who survived stopped being how fast a body could move and became how little it spent getting there. A trade that had been running at a loss began returning a profit, and selection did the remaining work across roughly 2 million years. No individual chose any of this. That account is the most defensible reconstruction the evidence allows, not a record of anybody's decision. Was anything on the other side ever large enough to cover it? Start with the debit column, because the debit column comes first in time. An ape that begins walking on 2 legs does not arrive at the human figure. It arrives somewhere in between, and the in-between is the expensive place to be. The immediate entry is the surcharge already described. On a chimpanzee's frame, 2 legs cost about 10% more than 4. Nothing is refunded later for having started early. Every generation between the ape and the modern skeleton pays that bill in full. The transition is not a doorway a lineage steps through in one season, and the corridor runs for millions of years with everything inside it billed at the higher rate. The fossil evidence agrees. Reconstructions of Australopith walking give a gait with considerably more bend at the hip and the knee than a modern human uses. More bend means more muscle held under tension for longer, and more muscle under tension means more oxygen burned per meter. These were bipeds paying above the human rate, none of them yet carrying the finished hardware that makes the saving possible. The debit does not stop at energy either. A body reorganized for the ground gets worse at the thing its ancestors were superb at. Arms shorten relative to legs, the grip of the foot weakens, and climbing becomes a skill performed by an animal no longer built for it. At the same time, the young cannot hold on, so an adult forelimb is occupied for years. And the balance problem never goes away, because the mass is still riding on one leg for most of every step. Add it up, and the picture is of an animal that has become a worse ape without yet becoming a good walker. That is the whole of the debit column, and every entry in it is real, and none of it optional. Now the credit column, which has exactly 1 entry. Physiologists measure the efficiency of moving bodies with a single quantity: the energy needed to carry 1 kilogram of animal, 1 meter of ground. They call it the cost of transport, and almost everything else about an animal's traveling life follows from that one number. A modern human's is startlingly low for a mammal of this size, and 4 features do the work, none of them the posture itself. The hip and the knee lock out straight, which lets the leg carry weight as a column rather than as a flexed spring held in place by muscle. A flexed limb has to be held there every instant it bears load, and muscle held under load burns fuel whether or not it shortens. A straight limb passes the load through bone. Bone works for free. The foot arches along its inner edge, and that arch compresses at landing and rebounds at push-off, returning a portion of the energy that would otherwise be lost into the ground. The big toe sits in line with the others rather than off to the side, so the final push travels straight down the length of the foot instead of sideways off a thumb. That alignment is the adducted hallux from the Laetoli prints, and it is doing mechanical work rather than looking human. And the whole limb is long, which stretches the stride without raising the number of strides. Each feature shaves a small amount from the same quantity. None of them is dramatic on its own. Together they take a body of roughly chimpanzee mass and move it for about a quarter of the chimpanzee price. The saving is not felt as speed. A cheap walker is not a fast one. The saving is felt as distance, which is a different currency entirely. It buys ground. Put the two columns beside each other with real distances in them. Walking costs a modern adult roughly 30 kilocalories per kilometer, a number small in isolation and charged on every single meter. A 12-kilometer foraging day comes to about 360. Cover the same distance on a chimpanzee's cost of transport, 4 times higher, and the same day runs to somewhere near 1,400. That difference is not a rounding error inside a budget. It is roughly the entire daily intake of a small ape, spent on transport alone. A body at the human rate can cross the landscape and still arrive with fuel to spare. A body at the ape rate has to stop well short of the far patch and eat whatever is closer. This is why the comparison that matters is range rather than speed. Hunter-gatherers cover 3 to 5 times more ground in a day than any great ape alive. That is not a difference of habit or of effort, but what a low cost of transport looks like once it is spent. The arithmetic also runs in one direction only. Cheap travel cannot be converted back into strength or into speed. It can only be converted into reach. And the ground bought this way is not empty ground. It holds patches the ape rate can never arrive at, which means a class of food that exists only for animals cheap enough to walk to it. So the trade resolves like this. Every separate item on the debit side stays true. The animal really is clumsier in the trees, encumbered by its own infants, balanced on a single leg for most of every step, and none of that is canceled or repaid or made good. It is simply outweighed by one quantity that gets spent across every meter of every day. Nothing was solved, nothing was repaid. The sum changed sign. The obvious conclusion from all this is that widening distance produces upright walking, and that conclusion is wrong. It has been tested. Chimpanzees in the Isa Valley of western Tanzania live in precisely the habitat the story requires. Their range is open miombo woodland, broken canopy, grassy understory, trees far enough apart that crossing between them means crossing ground. If open landscape drives animals down out of the trees and onto 2 legs, this community should show it. They spend more than 80% of their time in trees, about as much as chimpanzees living in closed forest. They walk on 2 legs for under 1% of their time, and when they do, roughly 86% of it happens up in the branches rather than on the ground. The result runs the other way. The bipedalism in that population is arboreal, and it appears while feeding. The open ground did not produce it. This is worth stopping on, because it changes what the mechanism is allowed to claim. Cheap travel explains why upright walking pays once a lineage already has the hardware, but not why one lineage out of many began building that hardware in the first place. Apes have stood on 2 legs in trees for millions of years, across several genera, in every kind of forest. Almost none of them went anywhere with it. The behavior is common, and the outcome is singular, and nobody can currently say what the missing condition was. Something else had to be true, and the fossils do not record what it was. The honest position is that this remains open. The distances widened for every animal in Africa. Only one lineage answered by rebuilding its skeleton around the walk. No ape alive supplies the missing condition, and no ape alive is going to. 4 extinct bodies supplied it. The oldest reasonably complete body in this story never settled on what it was. Ardipithecus ramidus lived 4.4 million years ago at Aramis, in what is now the Afar region of Ethiopia. The upper part of its pelvis had already been rebuilt to support an upright trunk, while the lower part had not, and stayed shaped for climbing. Below that, the foot kept a big toe that stuck out sideways and gripped. Whether that toe means this animal walked well, badly, or only sometimes has never been resolved. One animal, 2 systems, neither of them abandoned. To establish what world this body was operating in, the team collected roughly 150,000 fossil specimens of plants and animals from the same deposits, and the answer that came back was woodland. That result mattered, because it placed an upright walking body inside closed cover rather than out on open grass. Not everyone accepted the reading, and the argument over that landscape is still running. The pelvis was reconstructed from a crushed original, and specialists still argue over how much walking it actually did. The uncertainty is real. What is not in question is the mixture in the skeleton itself. The hands carry the same division, with long curving fingers shaped for closing around branches. A foot that can grab is a foot that bends through the middle. Bending through the middle is precisely what a cheap stride cannot afford, because the push at the end of a step needs a stiff lever to work against. Whatever this animal was doing on the ground, it was not doing it at the modern rate. And that is the reason for starting here. The walk did not appear once, finished. It appeared as a set of partial arrangements, each of which worked well enough for the animal carrying it. None of them was aiming at the next one. 1,000,000 years after RD, 2 different feet were pressing into the same landscape. One belonged to Lucy's species and had a big toe already pulled into line. The other did not. In 2009, at a locality called Bipedalism, in the Warrenso Mill study area of Ethiopia, a team recovered 8 bones from a single partial foot. The sediments date to 3.4 million years, which puts this individual in the same region and the same window as the animals that left the Laetoli trail. The deposits around it record river and delta channels running beside open woodland, another mosaic rather than a plain. The big toe on the Bipedalism foot sticks out to the side, the way a gorilla's does. And yet this was a walker. The bones are unambiguous on that point. They record weight moving forward and leaving the foot at the end of the step, and they also record where it left from. Instead of rolling off the big toe, as a modern foot does, this one pushed off through the second. Pushing off the second toe means the load runs down a different line through the foot. It also means the big toe stayed free to do something else, which in an animal with a divergent hallux means gripping. That combination looks strange, only if the walk is assumed to have one correct form. The foot sat unassigned for more than a decade, because a species is not usually named from bones below the neck. Jaws and teeth recovered later from the same deposits finally allowed it to be attributed, in 2025, to Australopithecus deirimeta. Warrenso Mill is the clearest evidence anywhere that 2 closely related hominin species shared one landscape at one time, doing the same job with different feet. Neither foot is a draft of the other. Nearly 1.5 million years further on, in a South African cave system called Malapa, a body turned up that walked in a manner no living animal uses. Australopithecus sediba dates to about 1.98 million years. The cave seems to have worked as a natural trap, a shaft that animals fell into and could not climb out of, which is why so much of the site survived undisturbed. The adult female skeleton preserves a heel, an ankle, a knee, a hip, and a lower back together, which is rare enough to let the whole gait be reconstructed rather than guessed at. Malapa has produced more than 200 hominin bones from at least 5 individuals, so the reconstruction rests on more than a fragment. The upper body of the same animal stayed primitive, with a shoulder and an arm still well suited to climbing. What the reconstruction describes is a leg swinging forward fully straightened, with the foot turned inward. The outer edge of the foot lands first. The ground then twists it violently inward, and the weight sweeps across to the inside before the step ends. Clinicians have a name for that inward collapse, because it turns up in modern patients as a complaint. They call it hyperpronation. In this animal, it was not a fault but the design. The team that published the reconstruction were careful about one thing. Most of the evidence comes from a single individual, and whether the species walked this way or only that female did cannot yet be settled. The caution is worth keeping. That distinction separates a finding from a story. Even so, the specimen shows something no amount of caution removes. 2 million years ago, there was a way of walking upright that has since vanished completely, leaving behind no descendant that moves like it. Nothing had committed yet. The last of the 4 is the one that stops looking strange. At Ileret, on the eastern side of Lake Turkana in northern Kenya, footprints are preserved in 2 sedimentary layers dated between 1.51 and 1.53 million years. They were left by Homo erectus. Reading them takes no interpretation at all, because they record the same three things a modern barefoot print records. The big toe lies in line with the others. The inner edge of the sole is lifted clear of the ground by an arch. The weight transfers to the inside of the foot immediately before the toes push off. Set beside the Laetoli trail, more than 2 million years older, the difference is not subtle. Laetoli records a foot that worked, and Aileret records a foot that works the way modern feet still work. By this point, the machinery is finished, and everything after it is refinement rather than redesign, which is where the four cases have to be read together rather than in a row, because they are not four stages of one process. They are four separate arrangements, overlapping in time, some of them alive at the same moment in the same valley, and only one of them leading anywhere. A grasping foot beside a walking pelvis, a second toe push-off, an inward collapsing stride, and finally an arch. The story that would be easier to tell runs the other way, with a single origin somewhere and a spread outward from it. The evidence will not carry that story. It shows the same arithmetic pressing on several different bodies at once, and each of them answering with whatever it happened to have. Convergence, not diffusion. 4 routes, 1 destination. The walk was not invented once and passed along. The same problem was solved repeatedly, in incompatible ways, by bodies that were never in contact and did not know a problem existed. Once the machinery was finished, it began rearranging everything around it. The Aileret footprints record more than anatomy. The surfaces preserve tracks from over 20 individuals, several of them large adult males crossing the same lake margin. That is rare and direct evidence of hominins tolerating one another at close quarters, and possibly of cooperation while foraging. Prints do not fossilize intention, so nothing here proves a hunting party. What they do show is a group crossing ground together, which is a social arrangement rather than an anatomical one. The daily range the cheap stride bought is also the range across which a group can scatter and reconvene. The body changed first, and the arrangements followed. The second consequence sits in the hands, because a body that no longer walks on its forelimbs can carry things across the distances the new stride made affordable. Carrying is not a small capability. It converts a landscape of scattered resources into a single larder, because food found at the far edge of the range can be brought back rather than eaten where it lies. And carrying created the problem it then had to solve. Infants had to be transported by hand, at 16% above the cost of moving the same weight in a sling, which means the sling, whenever it appeared, was among the most consequential objects this lineage ever produced. The sling is also completely invisible. Skins, bark, plaited fiber, and knotted cord do not survive, so the record contains no trace of the technology that made long-range foraging compatible with raising slow-growing young. The tools that survive are the ones made of stone. The tools that mattered most may not have been. The bill did not close when the skeleton was finished, and it has never closed since. In 2020, low back pain affected 619 million people worldwide. That makes it the single largest cause of years lived with disability on the planet, ahead of every other condition measured. The projection for 2050 is 843 million. A column of vertebrae stacked upright and asked to carry a trunk, a head, and whatever the arms are holding will fail in predictable places. And it does, at scale, continuously. Statistics on that scale stop registering as anything, so take one individual instead. Lucy, catalogued as AL2881, died about 318 million years ago in what is now Ethiopia. High-resolution scans of her skeleton show the upper end of the right arm bone shattered into 4 pieces. There are matching injuries at the left shoulder, a crushed right ankle, and a broken left knee. None of the breaks shows any sign of healing. That absence is the whole of the diagnosis. Anatomists call a fracture like that perimortem, meaning it happened at or around the moment of death rather than before it or long after. The team that described them read the pattern as a vertical deceleration event, a fall from considerable height with an arm thrown out at the last moment. Not everyone accepts the reading. Some specialists consider the evidence insufficient, and one group has proposed a mudslide with animal damage instead. The fractures and the absence of healing are not in dispute. The story told about them is, if the original reading is right, there is a bitter symmetry in it. The changes that made her cheap on the ground are the same ones that made her clumsy above it, and the trees she had climbed her whole life killed her. Walking had cost her the trees. 3 claims about this story circulate more than the evidence supports. The first is the Savanna. The familiar version says the forests of Africa shrank, the grasslands spread, and our ancestors stood up to cross them. The trouble is that the fossils keep turning up in the wrong habitat entirely. The team that described Ardipithecus argued that its woodland setting killed the idea outright. A second team went back through the same soils and phytoliths and read a savanna in them, and that argument has never been resolved. Then the living test came back against the prediction as well, with savanna-dwelling chimpanzees staying in the trees and doing almost all their upright walking there. Open country is not a settled explanation. The explanation remains open. The second claim is that hominins stood up to free their hands for tools. The order is wrong by well over 1 million years. The oldest stone tools yet found come from Lomekwi III, on the western shore of Lake Turkana, and date to 3.3 million years. Bipedal anatomy is visible at 4.4 million years, and possibly a great deal earlier, which leaves hands free for an enormous stretch before anything was made with them. Tools are downstream of the walk, not upstream of it. The third claim is the hardest one to give up. There was no first upright individual. Species boundaries are drawn backwards from the present by people sorting fossils into groups, and no animal alive at the time ever crossed one. At the far edge of the record, the evidence thins to almost nothing. Orang at roughly 6 million years and Sahelanthropus at roughly 7 are each known from a handful of limb bones, too few to describe how anything walked. What the record holds is a slow change of proportion across an enormous span of time. There is no morning, no threshold, and nobody who was first. That absence is the most important item on this list. Stand up. If sitting, stand, and if standing already, shift your weight onto one foot and let the other leave the floor. Hold it there. Something in your ankle is correcting, continuously, faster than you can notice and without being asked. You did not decide to do that, and nothing about it was ever learned or practiced. Every step you have taken today ran that same correction through that same joint. Every step landed heel first as a small collision and was paid for out of the same account. Every step balanced your whole mass over one leg and caught it before it went down. Every step pushed off through a big toe lying in line with the others, down the length of an arch that compressed on landing and handed the energy back. Every step cost a fraction of a kilocalorie, and there were thousands of them, and you noticed none of it. The account those steps were paid from is the one that has been running since the patches moved apart. The room you are in was built by animals with the same equipment, and the doorway is that height because bodies pass through it standing. The floor under you was leveled for feet. The stairs were cut to a rise a straightened knee can manage. The chair holds a spine that stacks vertically and complains when it is stacked too long. The distance you are willing to walk before deciding to drive is set by a number that was fixed in Africa long before anyone could have named it. None of it was designed around the walk. All of it was designed by animals who already had the walk and could not see it. And this is where the temptation is to call it a metaphor, or an echo, or a long shadow. None of those 3 words applies here. The mechanism in your ankle and the mechanism recorded in the Laetoli ash are the same mechanism, copied forward without interruption through every generation in between. Nothing restarted, nothing was reinvented, and no generation had to work it out again. 3 2/3 million years separate the two, which is not a comparison but a chain of custody, and your foot is the current holder. The last thing worth saying is about the ones who started it. They were not early versions of anything. They were not aiming at a species, or a city, or a floor leveled for feet, because none of those existed anywhere as ideas. They were animals crossing wet volcanic ash on a particular afternoon, on feet that happened to be slightly cheaper to move than the feet around them. The saving was so small that not one of them could have felt it in a single day, or in a lifetime, or across 100 lifetimes. It accumulated anyway. Not one of them knew what the arithmetic was building. Not one of them could have. They were only walking,